Okay, so today we're going to go over one-step equations. So with one-step equations, they call it a one-step because we only have to undo one operation to get the variable by itself. So notice in problem number 1, we have k plus 5 equals a negative 3. So we have k plus 5 on the left-hand side of the equals and a negative 3 on the right-hand side of the equals. And we want to undo to get the variable to be by itself. So you are trying to figure out what number could you add 5 to? So what number can you add 5 to that would give you negative 3? And you probably already know that answer. But right now we're looking at and trying to teach you the algebraic steps to be able to show your work properly, because we're going to be getting to some really crazy questions. So we have to start with the basics. So we're really talking about, how you're showing your work to get the variable by itself. So we want to get k by itself, and right now we have k plus 5. So we have to undo adding 5. So we undo operations by doing what's called the inverse operation. So the inverse operation of adding would be subtracting. So we're going to subtract 5 to both sides, because whatever you do to one side, you have to do the other. And then we're going to line up our equal signs so we can keep things nice and straight. So that leaves us a k, and then plus, and then a positive 5 and a negative 5 is 0. And then negative 3 minus 5 is a negative 8. And then k plus 0 is just k. So that leaves us k equals a negative 8. Number 2, we have the variable x on the left-hand side. So we have to undo the negative 4.2 that's on the same side as the x. So if we add a positive 4.2, when you add opposites, you always get 0. So negative 4.2 and positive 4.2 are opposites. Line up your equals. So opposites always give you 0, and 0 plus x is just x. And then on the other side, you've got more negatives than you do positives, so our answer is negative. And then we have to actually subtract because they're different. So that gives us x equals negative 5.5. So technically we could do this step in our head and then get to this step down at the bottom. So we could do this step in our head and then get to that step here and just say, on this side you got k plus 0 is just k, and then equals negative 8. And then on the left hand side we have this is 0 plus x is just x, equals negative 5.5. Number 3, notice that the variable is on the right-hand side this time. So our eyes have to go to the side that has the variable. So we need to undo subtracting 2/13. So to undo subtracting 2/13, we're going to add 2/13. And if we add 2/13 to one side, then we need to add 2/13 to the other side. Practice lining up your equals so that you get your sides are nice and organized. And then negative 2/13 and a positive 2/13 is 0. So that leaves you just n on this side, right? N plus 0. And anything plus 0 is just that thing. And then a negative 7/13 and a positive 2/13, right? You have more negatives than you do positives, so that's going to end up with a negative 5/13. So negative 5/13 is your answer. In problem number 4, it says a is being divided by a negative 5. A is being divided by a negative 5. So we're really trying to figure out what number could you divide by negative 5 and it would equal 2. And you probably already know what the answer is, right? We're looking at what number could you divide by a negative 5 that would equal 2. But remember, we're working on how do you show your undo step, your inverse step. So the inverse operation of division is multiplication. And you can show it using a dot, or you can show it using a parentheses. But we need, since we're dividing by negative 5, then we have to multiply by negative 5. Right? So you could have used a dot or a parentheses. So if you wanted to, you could have used a parentheses to show that. but no x for multiplication. So that gives you just a on this side, and then 2 times -5 is -10. And you might say, well, why is it that that gives us just a? Like, where is that coming from? Right? When you multiply fractions, don't you put a 1 underneath that? And then can't you cross cancel? And then when you multiply straight across, that's the reason why you get just the a on this side, in case you were wondering. Okay, number 5. Number 5 says 1/4 times what number equals -3? That's what we're trying to figure out. 1/4 times, right? That means multiply. What number equals -3? So we're going to undo multiplication by division, right? The inverse operation of multiplication is division. So that's going to give us x equals, and then we have to do a little bit of fraction work. So that's -3 divided by 1/4, and then we change division, multiplication, and reciprocate. Remember, that's how you divide fractions. So that's going to give us -12. So you had to do a little bit of fraction work, right? A little bit of fraction work. Let's look at number 6. Number 6, you have 2/3 times what number, right? 2/3 times what number equals 8. So to undo multiplication, we're going to divide, right? So we're going to divide by 2/3, because isn't any number divided by itself 1, right? Any number divided by itself is always going to be 1. So this gives you 1y, right? And 1 times y is just y, so that just leaves you just y. And on the other side, then we have to do some fraction work. So we have to do 8 divided by 2/3. So we write 8 over 1, change division and multiplication, and then reciprocate, right, or flip. And then when you multiply straight across, you get 24 over 2. 8 times 3 is 24, 1 times 2 is 2, and then 24 divided by 2 is 12, right? It's just a division fact question. So let's go back and look at those two problems again, because there's also another way you can do it, a fast way. Like, this takes a lot of work, right? That's a lot of extra work. So how could we streamline that? So instead of dividing by 1/4, instead of dividing by 2/3, there is a shortcut way. So let's look at that. And you can do it whichever way on tonight's homework, but because you should have seen this stuff before. So let's look at that again. So let's go back and look at those two. So instead of dividing by 1/4, you could have multiplied by the reciprocal of 1/4. So the reciprocal of 1/4 is just 4. So we're going to multiply both sides by 4. Because when you multiply reciprocals, you always get 1. So that's going to be 1x. And then -3 times 4 is -12. So when you multiply reciprocals, you always get 1. And then 1 times x is just x. And that seems like a lot easier than doing all that division of fraction stuff. So that's called multiplying by the reciprocal technique. So let's look at number 6 and try that technique. So since we're multiplying by 2/3, instead of dividing by 2/3, which we did earlier, we're going to use the multiplying reciprocal technique. So we're going to multiply by the reciprocal. And so what's the reciprocal of 2/3? That's where you flip it. That would be 3/2. So we're going to multiply by 3/2 to both sides. Because when you multiply reciprocals, you always get 1, right? That'd be 6 over 6, which is just 1y. So when you multiply reciprocals, you always get 1. And 1 times anything is just that thing. And then you just put a 1 underneath that, and you can multiply off to the side of your paper straight across. So you can do that maybe off to the side of your paper, and then 25 divided by 2 is 12. So see, it seems like multiplying by the reciprocal is a lot easier to do. So you can do it either way in your homework. Number 7, remember this means we're multiplying by a -1. So we want to undo multiplying by a -1. Since you're multiplying, we want to undo it by dividing by a -1. And that leaves you x equals, right? Because a -1 divided by -1 is just +1. And then 3 divided by -1 is -3. You could have, if you wanted to, you could have multiplied by -1. That also will get x by itself. So if you multiply this side by a -1, and you multiply this side by a -1. A -1 times x is just x, and a negative times a negative gives you that positive, and then 3 times -1 is -3. But for me personally, I just like to divide out the -1. I just think it seems easier just to divide out the -1. Now you can't just put negative, you need to put the -1. So that'd be x equals -3. And then number 8, we're multiplying by a fraction. So to undo multiplying, we can divide both sides by 4/7, because any number divided by itself is 1, and that would just leave you 1x. Then we have to come down here and we have to do 2/3 divided by 4/7. So we keep the first fraction the same, change division and multiplication as long as we reciprocate. And then when you multiply straight across, you get 14/12, and then we can reduce by 2. And if you reduce by 2, that means you're dividing both by 2, and that gives you 7/6. Right? That's the long way. So dividing by 4/7, that's a lot of extra work. So do you remember the other way? So instead of dividing by 4/7, do you remember what we just talked about? That you could do if you wanted to. Either way, you still have to show your work. Right? So the faster way would be just to multiply by the reciprocal, because when you multiply by reciprocals, you always get 1. So if this is 4/7, we're going to multiply by 7/4. That's the faster way. And that gives you x equals, and then you multiply straight across, you get 14/12, and then you reduce by 2. That means you're dividing both of them by 2, and that's where you end up getting 7/6. Right, so notice how that seems a lot less messy and easier to multiply by the reciprocal. So that method is really much easier. Your choice though. And then the last one. If you are dividing by a -10, if you're dividing by a +10, then we want to multiply by a +10. So you can either use the dot for multiplication or the parentheses for multiplication. Notice how I put the times off to the side and then line up your equals. And then 10 times -7 is -70. And if we put a 1 right there, those cancel out and leave us just n. Right? So those are quick one-step equations. You should remember this from 7th and 8th grade. So make sure you're showing the work to both sides, neat and organized, for credit for your homework.